Hello everybody, welcome to this talk which we've titled Genowhat. So I think I may well have had an introduction already, but as I'm not sure, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Jay Self. I'm a paediatric eye doctor in Southampton in the UK, and we run a regional and a national service for children with nystagmus. And we also do quite a lot of research, so we work with the University of Southampton looking really at a number of aspects in nystagmus which I won't go into now. I've been asked to talk about genetics in nystagmus. We've done this talk before, so it's similar to one that you may have seen a few years ago, but we've been asked to update it because there's always lots of questions and queries. And again, I'm going to base this hopefully on all the questions that people ask us in clinic and hopefully that are relevant to you. So it's very much genetics for beginners, but it's also genetics relevant for people with nystagmus. So the first question I get asked is, why bother? What's the point? You know, we hear about genetics, it's all very interesting, but is it actually going to do anything useful for me or my child who has nystagmus? And the answer is a resounding yes, it can be extremely important. And I'll go back to this at the end, but essentially the broad reasons to bother are that nystagmus is caused by a host of underlying conditions. Around 60 to 70% of children with nystagmus have it because of a genetic cause, and a number of those causes affect other parts of the body which may not be apparent when children first present with nystagmus. So that's the most important reason to try and find out what the cause is and whether there's other things we need to know for that person's health. The second reason is that as people get older or families extend, people often want to know about what the risk is of other people in the family having nystagmus, or whether a group of conditions which other family members seem to have are related to the nystagmus in somebody else. And so it's about information and future planning. And finally, the final broad reason is that there are a number of treatment options for nystagmus that we've had for a few years, but there's a lot of new ones coming out and we're getting much better at tailoring treatments to certain types. Now, what I mean by that is that if you had a sore stomach, you have abdominal pain, you wouldn't dream of treating everybody with that condition with the same tablet. What you do is find out what the cause is and then try and treat that cause. And that's really where we're moving with nystagmus nowadays. So it's important to know what your cause of nystagmus is if you're going to get access to these modern treatments and the best information. So that's the best answer really to the why bother question. The next question we get is, well, what's DNA? That's quite a big question, and I'll summarize it in the simplest way that I can. Essentially, DNA is the instruction kit that you have in every cell of your body. Now, one way to think about it is thinking about a flat pack furniture kit. So you'll usually get flat pack furniture with all the bits you need to build something, and then an instruction manual. And that instruction manual will have a whole load of words telling you what to do. And if you think about your DNA in every cell of your body as a copy of this instruction manual, you can start to get your head around the idea that a couple of spelling mistakes in the odd word in that manual doesn't really matter. And those spelling mistakes are responsible for everybody being a bit different. Everyone on earth is unique. Everyone who has ever lived is unique, because we all have a few different letters, and it doesn't matter. But if you get enough things wrong in a word or a sentence, you can start to change the meaning, and therefore you're going to build that flat pack bit of furniture not quite right, and that's when you start to get conditions or diseases. So the way to think about it, I guess, is like a flat pack furniture instruction manual that has some degree of tolerance. A couple of bits can get wrong and you shouldn't have too many problems. But if there are key parts which have spelling mistakes in them, like mutations in DNA, you will end up with a condition or a problem with your body, and that's a genetic condition. Now, you hear lots of words like chromosomes and things like this. These are all ways of packaging DNA. So DNA is the most important single template to think of. Think of it as a very long line of these letters. It's just 4 letters in a row, repeated in lots of different ways, and that's your single instruction kit. Chromosomes are just the way these are packaged in cells in your body. So that, in the simplest terms, really is what DNA is. And when we talk about genetics and genetic conditions, we're talking about changes in that sequence of DNA. So 1 or 2 or 3 or hundreds or thousands of those letters can be altered. And I will talk a little bit later about how that can work. So what can go wrong? Well, as I said, its instruction manual can be thought of as a single line of repeating letters. Now there's 4 different types of letters, so unlike the alphabet, there's only 4 different letters, and these are repeated in different formats all the way through this single line of DNA, but they're repeated a ridiculous number of times. So this sequence of DNA is about 3.2 billion letters long for a human. So it's unbelievably long. Now, things that can go wrong with it are you can have a spelling mistake or a mutation where just one of those letters is wrong. You can have mutations where whole chunks, whole words, whole chapters of your book, if you like, are missing. So they're big rearrangements, we call that in DNA. You can have duplication, so bits of DNA which are just randomly repeated over and over again, which can cause problems. You can have bits which are swapped around, so a whole chapter in a book. Imagine that instruction manual. If somebody then writes that whole chapter again but has flipped it round, so all the words are written backwards. There's all sorts of different combinations and strange things that can happen with DNA changes. This is where a lot of the complexity and some of the funny words come from, but essentially it's all describing the same thing. Something has changed the basic template of DNA enough that it means the body is built in a slightly different way, and if that's profound enough, it will cause a disease. If it's not profound enough, it will just cause the differences that we see between us all the time. So how are genetic conditions passed on? This is again a common question for us. The people have heard lots of things usually, often in pop science or on TV or on the news or whatever, about things which are passed on to 50% of children, or things that are only passed through the male line in the family or only the female line. That again, there is quite a lot of complexity. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but very broadly, the categories here are those conditions which we call autosomal dominant, which means that if I'm affected with a condition, every child that I have has a 50% chance of getting that condition. Then there are autosomal recessive conditions where I might have a spelling mistake in one of my genes, but I don't have the condition because I've got 2 copies and only one has a spelling mistake. My partner might have exactly the same situation, so we don't have a condition. But when we have a child, 1 in 4 of them will inherit both of our copies that don't work, so they will have no functioning from that gene. That, in very simple terms, is how recessive conditions work. And then there are some conditions which affect boys more than girls, and that's due to the fact that some diseases can be caused by the sex chromosomes. So these are the X and the Y for a man, or the X and the X for a female, for a lady, and the certain diseases can appear on the X chromosome or the Y chromosome. Again, I won't get too far into the details, but those are the 3 most common ways that genetic conditions are passed on. There are a couple of others, and one that's probably worth a mention is one called mitochondrial disorders. So most of the DNA we've been talking about, this long letter, this instruction manual, is in every cell of the body, and it's in the center part of the cell. So it's in the brains of the cell of every part of your body. There is some other bits of DNA in a different part of your cell, just to make it more complicated, that you only inherit from your mother, not from your dad. And that's called mitochondrial DNA. And there are some diseases which are caused by that as well. So again, I don't think it's worth trying to remember the details and the complexity here, but essentially the summary is that genetic conditions can be passed on in a number of complicated ways, and it's different for lots of different conditions, and it's different for lots of different conditions which cause nystagmus. So everybody with nystagmus will not have inherited it in the same way. And as I said before, there is around a 30% of kids who have nystagmus don't in fact have it for a genetic reason anyhow. They have something else that's caused their nystagmus. Good. So what genetic tests are there? Now this depends a little bit on where you are in the world, but broadly most regions of the world are at a similar stage with this. What's possible, if you like, the gold standard is not always rolled out in every country of the world, but broadly, if I just talk about what's available, what can be done, then the nuances of whether it's accessible in your particular area is a different question really. So in terms of genetic testing for nystagmus, as I said at the start, nystagmus is caused by lots of different conditions, which is why when most children start to develop nystagmus, so children born with it tend to get it between about 3 and 6 months of age. When that happens, most people's doctor will go frantically through a whole load of different tests looking for lots of different things, trying to look at a cause, and that's because it's caused by so many different things. The genetic testing replicates that. So what we tend to do when we're doing genetic testing is we try to look at all the clinical tests that we've done and try and narrow down the number of causes which are left as a cause for nystagmus, and then do genetic tests just on those causes. So what I mean by that is that if a child has eyes that move quite a lot at around 3 months, if we do tests which show their retina is not working very well, this is the bit at the back of the eye, that would suggest that that child has a retinal dystrophy which is causing nystagmus. So the tests that we'll do will be looking for retinal dystrophy genes. However, if all the tests at the start suggest that this child may have albinism, which is a common reason for having nystagmus, we might then do genetic testing looking at all the albinism genes and at various other nystagmus genes. So it's about trying to direct where you're looking based on the clinical tests, and as the genetics gets more powerful, we have bigger panels of genes to look at, but we always still need to know what's going on in the clinic. So what tests are yielding what the eye examination shows, because a genetic test on its own without any of that information is often very, very limited. Now, this little screenshot at the bottom that you can see, hopefully alongside my face, just shows a fairly complicated looking workflow. You don't need to, again, worry about the details of that, but essentially what that workflow is a way of diagnosing children with nystagmus that we've published a number of times and is available worldwide now. But essentially it's what most people would do, and it's the minimum set of tests really that people should have when a child is found to have nystagmus. And the reason I put it up is that you can see down the middle is a whole load of tests which lead to different tests, but at the edges everything ends up with a genetic test. Because we fundamentally believe that children haven't really been investigated fully until they've had genetic testing in nystagmus, unless there's a clear other reason for it. So another question that we get asked quite a lot is, how can genetic tests be inconclusive? So it sounds very binary. You have a genetic test, it looks at what your DNA is compared with what it should be, in inverted commas. It finds any things that aren't quite right, and there you go. That's your disease, mutation found. The problem is it doesn't work like that for a number of reasons. As I said earlier, everyone who has ever existed in the history of time will have different DNA to everybody else. Most of the little differences make no changes at all. Some of them will make subtle changes, like give me darker hair, or premature balding, or longer arms, or shorter toes, whatever. These are just responsible for the differences between us. But then there's a whole host of other changes which, if they're inherited in a certain way, can cause disease, and they're called mutations. So when we do testing, quite often we find lots of differences, lots of things which aren't normally there, but the clever bit is trying to interpret whether actually that's causing a disease or whether it's just part of normal variation. So that's one common reason why tests can often come back inconclusive. The other reasons are that no test is 100% reliable, sensitive and specific. What that means is that when we test a gene, there may well be other parts of that gene which we haven't discovered yet. It may well be that the test doesn't cover all parts of that gene quite so well. It may well be that we don't even know all the genes yet. So there's lots of reasons why genetic testing, when it comes back, can be inconclusive. And what this actually translates to is that in reality, a few years later, it's often worth revisiting genetic testing, because understanding it tends to leap forward so quickly, and the genetic tests that we do mirror that, so they change often on a yearly basis. So finally, the main point I wanted to make is that genetic diagnosis is really, really important. And hopefully you can see why. As I said at the start, it can be important for different people for very different reasons. Sometimes we have patients who come to us purely because for one specific reason relevant to their family, they really want to know what the cause of that nystagmus is, even though 10 people in their family have had it over lots of generations, There's no other condition that seems to be going with it, but there are just specific reasons why they desperately want to know what that genetic change is. There's also lots of families who want to know who else in the family may get it in the future. There's lots of people who want to know because they're trying to keep abreast of the new treatments that are coming up. And as I said earlier, lots of treatments are going to be specific to certain causes of nystagmus. And finally, the other reason why people want to know, and I think this is arguably the most important, is that lots of people present with nystagmus at a very young age, 3 to 6 months of age. And when their baby is brought to me in clinic and somebody's spotted that they have nystagmus and everything else seems roughly okay and the child is well, the range of diagnoses for that baby is huge. And there are a number of underlying conditions which we really don't want it to be, because they have significant implications elsewhere in the body. So doing genetics is incredibly important at that point as well. So I'm going to ask if you have any questions. This is pre-recorded, so I won't be able to hear them if you have them right now. But I think the plan is that I will attend on the day and hopefully you guys will have some questions for me. When talking about genetics, it's really hard to explain things and really nuanced details in a short talk, but hopefully you guys will be able to come up with some questions, and I really value the discussion. This is often the best bit of these talks. So I hope this has been helpful, and I'll probably speak to you in a minute.